and all our citizens all across Auckland should have this access. So this is the new highway of the future. No, it's actually not the future, it's the highway of now. One thing I just want to stress is I'm wondering, as we identify those criteria, how much attention we're going to give to those areas which have high deprivation levels. And I think Great Barrier Island, and then I look at the physical dislocation of Great Barrier. There's no easy road to get onto, to get back. To take a flight or a ferry is quite expensive. We know that income levels are extremely low on Great Barrier, and a lot of Waiheke as well. And there are other islands, there's Kawau, etc. So I'm just stressing some attention be given to deprivation, levels of deprivation, and those other physical barriers like water to be considered. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do you want to answer that?
I'm glad you raised that, because that's an issue that often is overlooked. Is that I think people have this conception of rural areas as the sort of rural gentleman farmer, and they often overlook the rural deprivation or levels of deprivation in some rural communities. And certainly, I think if we could get a quality information and had a bit more time to do a more robust analysis, which is something I'd like to do over the coming months, that's certainly something that we should be taking into account. And I think the case with Barry is a great example.
Thank you.
Thank you. No other questions, no other comments? With that, I'll put the motion. It's been moved by Councillor Webster, seconded by Councillor Cashmore. Put the motion. Those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Declare the motion carried. Thank you, officers. Very good. Good report and good presentation. Thank you. We now go to the item 10, earthquake-prone building legislation update. And there's been some quite considerable changes here, and Mr. Kamaskian and Ian McCormick, the building manager of building control, are here to talk about the changes. I think Ian's been right at the forefront or the vanguard of this issue. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillors, so thank you for receiving our report and supplementary memorandum. By way of overview, the purpose of this report is to obtain your authority to amend our current earthquake-prone, dangerous and unsanitary building policy, to update you on central government's progress in finalising the proposed earthquake-prone building legislation, how it's shaping up, and remaining opportunities for us to have some input. And finally, having received details of changes being proposed by the Select Committee in relation to this bill, seek confirmation that Councillor Wood and Councillor Nanai are able to continue to work with us to develop and submit on this latest consultation exercise. So by way of background, the agenda report to the committee was intended to update you on proposed changes to the bill as articulated by Minister Smith at a speech that he gave in May, and its potential impact on our current policy. Since the submission of the report that you have on your agenda, the Parliamentary Office has released a revised bill and invited submissions by the 16th of July. So it's a very tight time frame, very tight. So firstly, we seek your authority today to amend our earthquake-prone building policy. So our current policy provides for a 3-month time frame between receiving a seismic performance rating that a building is potentially earthquake-prone and then finalising it. And in that 3-month period, we enable an owner to consider the IEP rating that the building has been given by our structural engineers, to either obtain a detailed structural assessment of their building, decide to accept the assessment, or by default do nothing. And after that 3-month period, by default, we would finalise the rating of the building. So what we did in December, when it became apparent that the Minister was proposing a considerable departure from the bill that we consulted on as part of the Select Committee, we ended up suspending our building assessment program. and the finalisation program. We weren't certain how our work in progress would be treated under new legislation, and we thought it would be a safer course of action to simply suspend it and await to see what the resulting legislation would be and how it would affect those buildings. So it's resulted in a situation where we've now got a number of buildings that have been waiting up to and over 9 months for finalisation. So it means that we're currently out of step with our policy and we wish to amend our policy to cover that. We're seeking to amend the policy with words to the effect that we will suspend finalisation until the legislation is enacted in all but extraordinary circumstances. And extraordinary circumstances would be for a case such as where a building owner wants to actually have his building assessment finalised or has submitted us a detailed engineering assessment which it's actually he wishes to supersede the initial assessment rating that we've got for the building. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around the government progress on finalising the bill. So in our report, we've highlighted a number of changes proposed by the Minister in his speech in May. Now, these changes are reflected in the changes that are being proposed by the Select Committee, which we received last week. And we've now, as I've mentioned, been offered this opportunity to make some supplementary submissions on those changes, again by that 16th of July date. So at this stage we've had limited opportunity to review the detail. However, the key changes are, first of all, the establishment of 3 seismic zones based on risk of earthquakes. The scope of buildings to be assessed has been reduced to unreinforced masonry buildings. It's quite a significant reduction in scope to what we've got here. And again, that reduction in scope only applies to areas of low seismic risk, which Auckland falls into. There's a number of specific exclusions that are proposed around buildings which have a very low level of utilisation, farm buildings and low-risk buildings. There's quite a lot of information about what those types of buildings look like. But importantly, the timeframes have been significantly extended for areas in the low-risk area. So we've now, territorial authorities have been given 15 years in which to conduct an assessment and identify buildings which need to be assessed. Once they've been assessed, a building owner would have 1 year to actually go through an assessment process using a structural engineer. And then they would subsequently have 35 years to actually effect that remediation, so which is quite a long time. It's quite a significant extension to what we've currently got in our current policy for most buildings that require assessment. At the moment, it's 20 years, with again a 10-year addition for a heritage building. There's also some provisions around when you need to upgrade your building's seismic condition. And now it's proposed that if you are undertaking a substantial alteration to an existing building, that would trigger a seismic upgrade requirement. So that's different to what currently exists at the moment. It is only triggered at the moment through a change of use application. There's been a reduction in scope on the proposed National Earthquake-Prone Register. So rather than actually incorporating all of the details of the buildings that have been assessed under this scheme, and some of which are found not to be earthquake-prone, they're suggesting that under this scope, it would only be those buildings that have actually been assessed and found to be earthquake-prone. And lastly, and significantly, is the requirement around placarding at the entrance to buildings that are found to be earthquake-prone. So under this proposal at the entrance, if you have a building which has a NBS rating of 0 to 20%, it would be a red placard. If it was between 20 and 33%, it would be an orange placard. The wording on that placard has yet to be determined, but we understand that the intention is to have the same wording regardless of where that building is and which seismic area that building would be. Thus, what we see here is a prescription of interventions to address the challenging issue of earthquake-prone buildings, which are expensive to upgrade, and in areas of low seismicity. It's a challenging thing to come up with, and this is the prescription that central government have come up with. So whilst the time frame has been extended, one of the risks we get there is actually ensuring that owners actually do go ahead and actually upgrade their buildings. On the one hand, the good thing about it is it means that building owners won't need to upgrade buildings that are likely to be subject to developmental pressure and be upgraded or demolished in due course, just through developmental pressure. And I think we can imagine that many buildings that we see that are earthquake prone are probably, in the next 35 years, just in the natural course of events, through developmental pressure, will indeed be substantially upgraded, which of course will mean they need to be seismically upgraded as well, or maybe demolished and a new building that's more fit for purpose will be put there. On the other side of the coin, of course, there's the risk that the development pressures don't eventuate to the extent that we consider they will, and that we end up with an issue for subsequent generations to address. Now, that's mitigated in what we see here by the placarding requirement, and also by the requirement to seismically upgrade the building when you want to undergo a significant alteration. So it's managed in that way. So if a building owner wanted to ensure that he actually got the tenants that he wanted in that building, he would need to upgrade it, and obviously probably wouldn't want a red placard in the building. He'll tend to engage in tactical upgrades to the building, which will actually move it out of that 0 to 20%. Quite often it might be addressing chimneys or parapets and those types of things, which could be done relatively inexpensively and could well push it over that 0 to 20% in many cases, and which is the reason the ministers put that in place. What we do know, however, is that the distribution of our earthquake-prone and potentially earthquake-prone buildings, which are, in this sense, I'm talking about the buildings that have an initial assessment which indicates they're earthquake-prone, but we've yet to receive confirmation through a detailed engineering assessment or finalise it. They tend to reflect the development of early Auckland. So you'll tend to find them in places like the CBD, you'll tend to find them in places like Devonport, you'll tend to find them along those early arterial routes, Dominion Road and Mount Eden Road, and you'll find them in places like Otahu. And so you can expect with this placarding requirement, when it's enacted in legislation, that buildings in those areas, many will have red placards. One of the things that's important to realise is when you think about these red placards, imagine if it's similar to Wellington and you end up with a red placard the size of an A4 piece of paper. If we actually applied the relative seismic risk of an earthquake in Wellington and then contrasted it with that in Auckland, you would probably need a microscope, possibly quite a powerful one, to be able to read the writing on the placard, the red placard you'd be putting on a building in Auckland. So the question would be, is it reasonable to put red placards on buildings in Auckland when the risk is so insignificant compared to the risk of crossing the road, and many other things that we do in a normal course of events? Finally, we've got some really tight timeframes around consultation. So we're really looking at your authority in terms of an approval for an approach to signing off a supplementary submission in relation to this. And we would ask that we're able to continue to work with Councillor Wood and Councillor Nanai, who have previously identified by this committee as the officers interface with elected representatives, and to work with a group of officers to actually come up with a submission and then authorise that submission and put it through to the Parliamentary Office. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move the recommendation. Councillor and I will second it. And are there any questions at this stage? Councillor Casey and then Mr. Wilcox.
I was just interested in the specific exclusions. Are we supportive of all of that, or is there any chance that that's going to be changed?
Patrick.
Most of the exclusions that the Minister has announced are already ones that we wouldn't particularly be looking at anyway. We're talking wharves, silos, mainly industrial structures, isolated sheds. The most notable inclusion that the Minister has made to those specific types of buildings is isolated rural structures, which from a technical perspective they are low risk anyway, so I think that we can be in support of that.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox.
Thank you, Chair. Would this apply to marae? I can only think of one that's made of brick in Auckland.
Are you referring to the one along
Bridges and
Manukau Road?
No, I'm talking about Te Puia.
We've only had one structure owned by a marae that has fallen under our assessment schedule so far, and that was Church Down Tamaki Drive. We haven't had any others come up. If it were essentially a pre-World War II unreinforced brick masonry structure, then yes, it would qualify.
Okay. So then there is a Maori impact. There is a possible Maori impact, because your Maori impact says should be no impact on Maori.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, ka pai. Don't forget the mihi, eh?
Yep.
In your submission, ka pai.
Councillor Darby?
Thank you. Just brief feedback on the possibly required red or orange tag that would have to be just like a health certificate that, you know, the A, B, C grades, and then there's the alcohol certificate and everything else. But I'm just a little bit concerned, and I'm just wondering whether in the further submission, Mr Chair, you might like to consider with Councillor and I submitting on that particular point. Remembering we are in the lowest risk zone, it's been broken up 3. I think to be red dabbing buildings in low risk zone is a pretty big call, because the public will be looking at that like they look at the health certificate, whether the restaurant they're going into is worthy of eating at. They'll be thinking, is this building worthy of being at? Little will they know they're in the low risk zone, one of the lowest risk zones in New Zealand. So I just want to, maybe the Chair and Councillor and I would like to consider that when you're putting together your further submission. Just, I gather, my other questions really are, I gather this whole body of work that we're geared up to do is now no longer required. So what impact does that have on our budgets? How positive is that to our budget? Has there been any calculation of that?
We'd almost expired the budget for that piece of work. We've done something like 7,000 assessments in Auckland, so we've almost assessed all of the buildings that we originally thought we needed to assess. So under the existing policy, there'd probably be another possibly, I think, 2,000 or 3,000, which we've subsequently identified, which are low-risk buildings, which we could, under our existing policy, require assessment, but won't require assessment for the main part under the new policy. So we're pretty much bang on, actually.
And that takes into account the confirmed budget for the next 10 years as well, for the next 1 or 2 years of that. So,
to be honest, we were, my recollection, we've got really very little, if any, budget in successive years for this program. The assessment program that we've done is pretty much over. It was a program that we used GHD to do, so structural engineers going out doing those assessments for us, and that was what the budget was for.
and a lot of it unnecessarily, by the sound.
No, a large number of the buildings we've done would still require assessment under the new policy. So, yeah, that's yeah. I wouldn't say it was wasted by any stretch of the imagination.
And just a quick point, one of the other things we need to bear in mind is even if we as a regulatory authority are only now required to assess unreinforced brick masonry buildings, we still will have to bear in mind that the market may respond quite differently to this. On a regular basis, we get queries on the performance of buildings even constructed 5 or 10 years ago. So the fact that we had proactively engaged with these buildings since 2011 and assessed structures built after World War II means that we have a lot of information that building owners, tenants, prospective purchasers have been able to utilise to guide their decisions around our built environment. So I wouldn't say that it's wasted, it's just we're taking a different tack on things now.
And finally, Mr Chair, the register that's going to be established, that's not funded and operated by councils, that's a government entity that would be operating that register?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah.
Sorry. Councillor Wilson.
Yes, how many of the buildings you've assessed would be council-owned? Or just, not accurately, but I mean, a lot of them would be halls.
In terms, so we've had a slightly divergent process there. We started off in 2011 focusing on high priority structures, ones with particular value to the community, especially in a post-disaster situation. This meant that we assessed a lot of council-owned structures, such as our town halls, community centres and so forth. We probably carried out an assessment on around about 300 or so such structures before it became identified that we really needed to think about our broader portfolio as well. So there's been a slightly independent process going through our property department where they have been looking at a lot more. Not sure of the exact figures around that, but what we do know is that there is a very low number of buildings that would potentially be earthquake prone that we own.
Okay, thanks. I just know that that's what closed the law was town hall, so.
Right, thank you. Well, I just want to say that I think we've made a lot of progress here, and the Minister has certainly changed his stance after I think we submitted to the Select Committee. Mr McCormick and I went with a delegation from Local Government New Zealand to see the Minister at one stage, which I think he then said he'd come back, and he's now come back and he has changed it. But this business of placarding the buildings with the yellow and red placards is an issue that we have to look at. Yep. But Mr McCormick, I don't think that's some buildings will be able to change their position quite, well, with not a lot of changes, wouldn't they be able to strengthen their facades and strengthen other parts of the building, and then they'll have the placard taken away?
That is correct. In our original submission, we were really focused on some of those high-risk structures in buildings, which we were keen to have addressed, like parapets. So this is the sort of thing that could address that and move buildings out of red into.
So I think you know, as we've got in the motion, that we request our staff to engage with Local Government New Zealand, continue that work, because it's important that they do. And we also have representatives at political level at Local Government New Zealand who can also put our message through to the appropriate areas of Local Government New Zealand, because it's I don't think some areas in New Zealand didn't really engage too much with this, but others have got real concerns, like Wellington especially, and the main centres. But I think it really covers probably most of New Zealand, but they haven't got the time maybe to engage like we have been able to do. So thank you for the work and keep it up. Our councillor and I.
Just a quick question, Ian. Who's taking the responsibility of informing the public as to what the placards mean? Is that central government's responsibility? Is it going to be our responsibility?
There has, as far as we know, there hasn't been any decision made around that yet.
So can I just ask another question? It's just in relation to the Minister, dealing with the Minister. Has he talked about any assistance to bring buildings up to standards?
No,
These things
no,
never come with a check.
not that I've heard. That might be something else that might be worth raising.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that should be kept in mind when we're dealing with his officials. Okay then, with no other comments, I'll put the motion. Those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Declare that carried. Thank you very much, people. Thank you.